Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to welcome you to the 2021 Black Church Studies Colloquy. My name is Hugh Page, Vice President and Associate Provost for Institutional Transformation and Leadership Development, and also a faculty member in the Theology and Africana Studies departments. It's a particular joy and honor to be holding this colloquium in conjunction with the Black Catholic Theological Symposium's meeting here at Notre Dame. The Black Church Studies Colloquy was launched in 2013 to create an intellectual space specifically for conversation about the Black Church, its history, its status, and its emerging challenges, as well as the future of that interdisciplinary endeavor, Black Church Studies, devoted to its critical examination. Utilizing a model at once global and discursive, its larger aim is to facilitate discussion among clergy, laity, scholars, and the general public about the role of the Black Church, broadly understood, in the Africana world. An initiative of Notre Dame's Department of Africana Studies, it has sponsored lectures and workshops by a number of notable scholars and church leaders, including Drs. Ronald Peters, former president of the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, Barbara Holmes, former president of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, Alton Pollard, former dean of the Howard University Divinity School and current dean at the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and Otis Moss III, pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois. For those of a particular age working at the nexus of theology and Africana studies, the flowering, waning of support for, and renaissance of interest in Black church studies programs in this country is well known. Many of us have watched as programs dedicated to this important field have waxed and waned. Many of us have observed admiringly the work that many eminent colleagues have undertaken as leaders of such programs. And many of us have celebrated the release of monographs and textbooks, further anchoring it within the larger spectrum of theological disciplines. There are some 24 programs of various kinds focusing on the study of the Black Church now operating at universities, seminaries, and divinity schools around the country, and we at Notre Dame are delighted to be one such initiative. Though modest in scope, our colloquy was intentionally designed to be a series of periodic and thematically driven discussions about pivotal issues impacting the Black Church and its members. It is envisioned as a forum, bringing together members of our academic and local communities that would be facilitated by a national or international leader in the field. Using Africana palaver, or extended, relationally focused discussion as its paradigm, our aim has been to create an ongoing and sustainable conversation that is informative and builds community among those for whom the Black Church is a focus of intellectual inquiry and for those for whom it is a home. Therefore, it is a pleasure to be here for our 5th colloquy, and it is my honor to yield the podium to my friend and senior colleague, Dr. Mark Sanders, Chair of the Department of Africana Studies and director of our new Initiative for Race and Resilience in the College of Arts and Letters, to introduce our featured speaker this afternoon, Dr. Sanders.
Good afternoon. As my colleague said, this is it's an honor and a privilege for me to introduce Bishop Braxton, which I will do momentarily, but beforehand, there are a couple of housekeeping items we need to address. First and foremost, anyone who's on the back wall, please make sure you do not lean on the light switch. We need the lights to stay up. Number two, Bishop Braxton has asked me to ask you, if you are in the back rows, to please come forward to some of the seats that are further forward. We can pause and wait for you all to come forward. And as we wait, the third housekeeping item is to make sure that you all got the handout coming in. If you didn't, they are in the back on a seat, but it's crucial in terms of following the lecture. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are happy to welcome Bishop Edward K. Braxton back to Notre Dame as our speaker this afternoon. A former member of the Faculty of Theology, the bishop has returned to speak on several occasions. He is a bishop who is as comfortable in the podium of a university classroom as he is in the pulpit of a cathedral. He holds a PhD in religious studies and an STD in systematic theology from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. A recognized expert in the thought of Bernard J.F. Logren, the bishop has also served on the theology faculties of the Catholic University of America, the Harvard Divinity School, and as the scholar in residence at the Pontifical North American College in Rome. The bishop served for many years as Chancellor for Theological Affairs for James Cardinal Hickey, the late Archbishop of Washington, D.C. For more than 30 years, he served as the official theological consultant to William H. Sadleir Incorporated, a leading catechetical publisher. His writings have appeared in the Harvard Theological Review, the Irish Theological Quarterly, Chicago Studies, America, Commonwealth, Origins, National Catholic Reporter, and other journals. He is the author of The Wisdom Community, The Faith Community, and The Church and the Racial Divide. Bishop Braxton is a leading voice in the Catholic Church on the racial divide in the United States and in the church. His writings have led to invitations to lecture at Northwestern University, the Catholic University of America, Georgetown University, Purdue University, St. Louis University, and the University of Chicago. At the invitation of Peter Cardinal Turkson, prefect of the Vatican Congregation for the Promotion of Integral Human Development, the bishop participated in the Vatican's International Conference marking the 50th anniversary of Pope Paul VI's encyclical Populorum Progressio on the development of peoples. He has served as auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, the bishop of Lake Charles, Louisiana, and after 15 years of service as bishop of the Diocese of Belleville, Illinois, he became Bishop Emeritus in July 2020. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Braxton, who will speak on the Catholic Church and the racial divide in the United States.
Almighty Father, incline thine ear. Bless us and all those who gather here. Thine angels send us, who shall defend us, and fill with grace all those who dwell in this place. Amen. Peace be with you. I'm very happy to return again to the campus of Notre University, and I certainly appreciate the invitation from the conveners of the colloquium as well as the symposium to come to you at this time. The remarks that I will give this afternoon are delivered from what I call a moving viewpoint. They are divided into two parts, and hopefully they will allow me to cover a wide range of key themes. All of you should have a copy of the outline. If you don't have it, I recommend that you get it. Otherwise, you might get lost in the moving viewpoint. The outline is there for all of you to read. Please follow the outline so that we can be in the same place at the same time. The Catholic Church and the Racial Divide in the United States, Part 1. What is the shape of the church to come? Two perspectives. Some say that the shape of the church to come will be very different from the Catholic Church today. The number of priests will continue to decline, forcing unforeseen changes in ecclesial life and Catholic worship. There will be far fewer parishes and even fewer Catholic schools. The ministry of priests will necessarily evolve and adapt to deacons and members of the Christian faithful, assuming more and more positions of ministry and leadership. The tension between the hierarchical structure of the church and the consensus-building, community-wide decision-making will spill over into the daily life of Catholics. Women will assume new positions of responsibility. The number of practicing Catholics will be smaller, and interest in ecumenism and Christian unity will decline. The debate about challenging issues concerning the dignity of human life, social justice, human sexuality, the nature of marriage and family life will create opposing camps of so-called old Catholics and new Catholics. A future pope may try to address these by convoking the Third Vatican Council, but by then, the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome will be exercised in a very different way. In some quarters, public theological discourse will gradually begin to express itself in a more irenic dialogue with the magisterium of the Catholic Church. And for many reasons, the number of African American Catholics, already very small, will almost certainly decline. What is the shape of the church to come? Others say that the future church will not be like this at all. A renewal of Christ-centered spirituality will empower the church to challenge what Charles Taylor calls this secular age, and the number of priests and religious sisters will dramatically increase. More and more young people will become deeply involved in the life of the church, leading to a rebirth of parish life and a greater love for traditional Catholic worship. The number of practicing Catholics will grow larger and larger. New modes of Catholic education will emerge and flourish. The spirituality of the Christian faithful will be stronger, and the laity will be anxious to give more of their time, talent, and treasure to the work of renewing the body of Christ. Catholics in larger numbers will embrace the Church's traditional moral teachings. The Pope will emerge with new strength and even greater authority and a more centralized Petrine ministry. Most of those who hoped for radical changes in the Catholic Church will have found spiritual homes elsewhere, but the Petrine ministry will remain a stumbling block to structural unity of the diverse Christian communities. In some quarters, public theological discourse will express itself more and more in dissent from the magisterium of the Catholic Church. This group also thinks that for many reasons, the number of African American Catholics, already very small, will continue to decline. What is the shape of the church to come? Ultimately, the shape of the church to come will be determined not by any of us, not by any priests, bishops, or popes, but by the provident and inscrutable Holy Spirit. However, even with that providence, it is likely that the sentence that concludes both visions of the future will prove to be prescient. Namely, for many reasons, the number of African American Catholics, already very small, will almost certainly continue to decline. If, in fact, the number of African American Catholics grows smaller in the next 50 years, that reality will have a direct impact on the way the Black Lives Matter movement contributes to public theology in the Catholic tradition. B, the racial divide. A primary reason for the small size of the African American Catholic population is the racial divide in the United States. Note, I prefer the expression the racial divide as a broad description of racial division and reserving the word racism for overt, horrendous manifestations of that divide. Today, many individuals, groups, and the media commonly use the word racism and racist to cover a wide range of expressions of racial bias, from minor insults to outright acts of injustice and even the enslavement of free human beings. Instead, I use the broad expression, the racial divide, of which racism is the most damning and most egregious example. If even the smallest expression of racial bias, prejudice, and cultural insensitivity is an example of racism, then I am afraid we might need to note that we may as well call everyone a racist, because most all of us are guilty of some form of ethnic or racial bias. I remember many years ago hearing an address at a conference that was titled On the Road to Dialogue for Racial Harmony. And the first speaker got up and said, and this is a quote of the speaker's first sentence, "Whether you know it or not, all of you are a bunch of white racists." To me, the possibility of dialogue ended there. If a speaker presumes to address a group of people that he has never met before, about whom he knows nothing, to make such a blanket statement, he is one of those people who does not understand the difference between racism, the racial divide, and small acts of insensitivity. C, racism. Let me elaborate now on the distinction that I make between the racial divide and racism. The racial divide began when European merchants presumed to bring the first free men and women of color in chains from West Africa to the United States in 1619 to provide free laborers as the engine of the Southern economy by working as beasts of burden on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantation. See Edward Baptiste's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. This divide has continued throughout American history, including the Civil War, the Lost Cause era, the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, which argued, in effect, that African people have no standing before the courts since they were not human beings, but mere property. Sadly, this Dred Scott opinion was written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Roman Catholic who himself owned enslaved free human beings. Note that I underscore the grave moral evil of racism by avoiding the word slaves. Instead, I speak of enslaved free human beings. If one uses the word slaves, that implies that there are a group of people already out there in the world who are slaves by their intrinsic nature. This obviously is untrue. It is a use of words that diminishes the absolute immorality of enslaving free human beings. Clearly, before God, all people are always and everywhere free, with equal value and equal dignity. The fact that morally corrupt societies presume presume falsely that they can buy, own, and sell free human beings does not make them intrinsically and of themselves slaves. To underscore this essential, often overlooked point, I speak instead of enslaved, free human beings, because from a Christian perspective, these sisters and brothers of ours, even in the midst of degradation, were, are, and always are free. Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Catholic, a man who somehow did not allow his faith in Jesus Christ to open his eyes to the dignity and the worth of every human being. This unjust divide that he perpetuated continued with Jim Crow laws, the frequent lynching of African American men, women, and children, especially between 1880 and 1940. This same divide continued up to the cruel murder of Emmett Till, the murder of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and continues now as we reflect on the murder of Mr. George Floyd and so many other questionable deaths of African American people since him at the hands of white representatives of law enforcement. The racial divide is apparent to this day in the systemic and systematic treatment of people of color as inferior and undeserving in this country. This leaves them at a disadvantage when they seek good education, meaningful employment, decent housing, quality health care, and every other form of benefit and social advancement. Tragically, the Catholic Church and Catholic institutions have often helped to perpetuate this divide. All of these are instances of the racial divide, and they're all examples of what we mean when we use the term racism. D, most Americans are not racist. Most Americans are not racist. This does not mean that most Americans, including Catholics, are racist. It is very difficult to harbor truly racist attitudes and belief in one's heart without realizing it. Most Americans and most Catholics are probably not racist in the way that I use the word. However, it is possible for someone to live with unconscious or barely conscious awareness that they harbor biases, prejudices, stereotypes that influence their attitudes toward people of different races. People may even acknowledge that these attitudes are wrong and constitute a genuine moral fault. But just as they never do anything to uproot these wrongful attitudes from their hearts, they never ever do anything deliberately or say anything that directly harms people of the groups in question. They simply say casually in conversation with some people, you know, I just don't like those colored people. You know, I just don't like those Jewish people. Those are instances of racial bias which are a moral fault. But left as it is, I would not call that racism. These attitudes, this moral fault, is spawned by the racial divide. They only become the moral evil and grave sin of racism when individuals and groups allow these biases to lead them to think that they are objectively superior to all members of the group in question. This denial of universal human dignity and worth can easily lead to the affirmation of white privilege and white supremacy, examples of racism to be sure. This is expressed in hostility and open hatred, including a willingness to harm, oppress, even enslave free people of a different race. This form of the racial divide is racism that is manifest not only by pejorative language and racial slurs, but depriving people of their natural and their civil rights, such as voting, living where they wish to live, the opportunity to obtain good education, to obtain good health care, and to pursue a career in whatever field that they wish. When it turns to depriving people of their humanity in any way, that becomes not simply an instance of the racial divide, but racism. Those who live each day oblivious of the biases, prejudices, and racial stereotypes that influence them may never speak or act in a crudely racist way. They may never advert to the fact that they are the beneficiaries of systemic racism that has had an impact on all dimensions of American society, including the Catholic Church. It is not by chance, for example, that most Catholic parishes are to this day in racially segregated neighborhoods. This is due in part to the fact that the Catholic Church was largely on the wrong side of history from the very beginning of the racial divide, but simply because most Catholics live in neighborhoods that are racially segregated does not lead to the absolute conclusion that all white Catholics are necessarily racist, but they are beneficiaries of racist attitude that are spawned because of the racial divide. Today, in the Catholic Church, a growing number of the Christian faithful, the laity, religious deacons, priests, and bishops who serve them are deeply aware of the racial crisis in this country, and they are sincere in their desire to bridge the racial divide. As Christians, as members of the body of Jesus Christ, all Catholics are called to learn their faith, to love their faith, and to live their faith. And because of that, they should be committed to overcoming minor expressions of racial bias, which I distinguish from racism, to overcoming not only minor expressions of racial bias, but also the major evil of prejudice when it reaches the level of racism, overt racism. C, there are no minority Americans. There are no minority Americans. One of the direct consequences of the racial divide is the peculiar way in which Americans use the term minorities and minority groups. These are manipulative and self-serving terms in the peculiar way that they are developed. Are there really minority Americans? Are there really minority Catholics? If one thinks critically about what it means to be an American, to be a Catholic, we can see why these words are not used in an objective way. They are the language of power and control, defining people not by who they are, but by what they are not, who they are not. Critical thinking easily forces us to recognize the fact that the words like minority and minority group are used quite selectively in American society. They are not applied consistently in reference to all ethnic groups that make up statistically small numbers of citizens. At times, these expressions seem to be used as code words with subtle negative connotations. Why are only certain groups of people minorities? These words beg the question, which American citizens are the majority? Who constitutes the majority group? How did they become the majority? There are no ethnic Americans in the same sense that one might speak of ethnic Japanese in Japan, for example. There is no single ethnic, racial, or cultural group that constitutes true Americans. No single group. Every citizen of the United States is fully and equally an American in the exact same sense of the word. Citizens who are descendants of passengers on the Mayflower are not somehow more truly American than descendants of passengers on slave ships, native people of the Mohawk Nation, or the most recent immigrant from Afghanistan or Haiti. If they are citizens, then they are Americans, precisely because there are no ethnic Americans. Reflection on the meaning of the expression e pluribus unum, from many one, excludes the possibility of designating minorities in the United States, unless, of course, we acknowledge that all citizens should be designated as members of minority groups. Obviously, this truth is not acknowledged by most sectors of American society. The Catholic Church, the New York Times, other newspapers, and the local and cable news stations regularly speak of minorities. European Americans with roots in Ireland, Germany, Italy, or Poland, for example, were once ostracized in this country as immigrants, foreigners, and undesirable minorities who need not apply, who need not move into our neighborhood because they were not members of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group. This was also true of Jewish people. Despite the despicable recent examples of anti-Asian violence, people of Asian background have not constantly been spoken of in this country as minorities. But why are some people usually not considered minorities today? The answer is not because any one of the Western European groups now somehow constitutes the statistical majority of the United States population. If you have read Matthew Fry Jacobson's magisterial book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, you know that the process of gathering those Americans whose ancestors were from various European countries with very little in common and making them into one group called white people, the majority, and relegating everyone else as minorities is historically a rather recent and arbitrary development. Minority-majority language is not neutral language. It controls meaning and the way people perceive themselves in a social context. It gives one group a vantage point of power from which they can brand others with negative identity as what they are not. See Noel Ignatiev's book, How the Irish Became White. This is simply a language game, but a powerful language game it is. It is a language game which at certain junctures excluded even European Americans of certain backgrounds as despicable ethnic minorities. In the present usage, the term minority group often connotes the haves versus the have-nots, the powerful versus the powerless, the assimilated versus the non-assimilated, because they have not assimilated middle-class mores and the cultural heritage of Western Europe. As a result, even when the majority of the residents of a city in the United States are African Americans or Hispanic Americans, the media still terms them minorities. The Catholic Church in the United States should not uncritically accept or even unwittingly perpetuate terms like minorities and minority groups, which are almost never neutral and which are never applied to all Americans who are members of statistically small numbers. Swedish Americans, for example, are a relatively small part of the population. However, when you've ever seen an article in the newspaper, Swedish Americans, a minority group. Well, why not? They are a minority. Why are they not a minority group? Norwegian Americans are a small number relatives, but you never see the evening news. Watch our broadcasts on minority problems in the city, all about people from Norway and Sweden. Why not? The answer is simple. They are part of an artificial conglomerate called white people, and that is an artificial structure to create a political power framework of the majority group. As a Roman Catholic bishop, I am very aware of the fact that many of my friends in growing numbers who are Protestant Christians rightly insist that Catholic Christians stop referring to them as what they are not, refer to them as what they are, refer to them as Christians of other traditions, or as Lutherans, or Methodists, or Baptists, rather than non-Catholics. Why do Catholics presume to call them non-Catholics? No one ever calls a Catholic a non-Presbyterian or a non-Baptist. But this is the language of power, intentionally or not, naming people by what they are not, as opposed to naming them by what they are. I never call my colleagues who are Presbyterians, Lutherans, Anglicans, Baptists, non-Catholics. I learn their tradition and greet them as brothers and sisters in Christ as what they are, not as what they are not. Sadly, this negative language game is appropriated by the groups in question so that many Protestants themselves, for lack of forethought, call themselves non-Catholics. And of course, African-American people taking on the language of power call themselves minority groups. Words matter. One needs to put words right. Words matter. F, Afrocentric religious art and the Catholic Church. One small step that could contribute to bridging the racial divide and overcoming the bias caused by relegating African American people to minority group status would be to face the invisibility of people of color in Catholic religious art. The church could easily include Afrocentric religious art in its churches and many other places where iconography is present. Many years ago, before I was a bishop, I took a group of African American Protestant children studying in a Catholic school to visit a Catholic church. so I could explain the role of art in Catholic worship. On the way, one of the children told me he did not wish to go because his grandmother told him that the Catholic Church was a white racist institution that did not want to welcome African Americans to their services. I told this precocious 8th grader that while some Catholics are surely prejudiced, even racist, the Catholic Church is open to all and universal, and it is not or should not be prejudiced or racist. But when we entered the church, the curious children saw that all the images of the sacred were in Eurocentric art. All images of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and all the saints and angels are painted as Europeans. God the Father himself is a distinguished older white gentleman with blue eyes and a flowing white beard. The 8th grader asked, if God is a spirit with no race or nationality, why is God pictured as an elderly white man? As he and other children looked at all the images in the church, one of them asked, Father, does the Catholic Church believe that only white people are in heaven? One girl asked, if angels have no bodies and no gender, if they are spirits, why are they all pictured with blonde hair, blue eyes, and rosy cheeks? Couldn't at least the angels represent all races? Couldn't the church at least have a statue of a magnificent African-American or Afrocentric angel who looks like a great African-American athlete? Another asked, why are there no Black, Asian, or Latino saints in the windows of this church? Later, I discussed this experience with the teachers, and they asked, wouldn't the Catholic Church be more welcoming of all people if the church were to picture holy women and holy men of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds? After all, though we know that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were Jewish, no one knows what they actually looked like. Wouldn't that small gesture of aesthetic diversity be a powerful asset to evangelization? Wouldn't white Catholics find that a welcome change, or would they object and stop contributing to the support of the church? Several teachers asked, if the Catholic Church would ever depict racial diversity in its art, wouldn't that be a step forward? Another said, I don't think the church ever will. And still another says, you're right, they won't. And someone said, well, why not? Why not? I myself have asked this question for years in my published writings. Yet new Catholic churches are dedicated year after year with art that loudly proclaims that the kingdom of heaven is reserved for white people only. A picture is worth 1,000 words. G, all lives matter. All lives matter. If the Catholic Church cannot make the small step of diversity in its iconography, it might be understandable if African Americans feel that they do not matter to the church. Black lives do not matter. Of course, since as Christians we believe that all lives matter, surely Black lives must matter. Still, I do not believe that Black lives matter and all lives matter are incompatible ideas. However, sometimes all lives matter is used in a way that diverts attention from the urgent concerns of African American people. For there to be true compatibility between the two expressions, it is necessary to acknowledge the legitimacy of the existential crisis that many African Americans are experiencing in this country right now. If you are secure in your comfortable home with your family on a cold winter night, sitting around the fireplace with more than enough to eat, fully at ease and at peace, you and your family members know that your lives matter. But if the doorbell rings and there is a shivering, starving, homeless family at the door in dire need of food and shelter, and you look at them in dismay and you tell them, it's only about a 4-mile walk to the nearest shelter, go there, and they will give you food and something to warm yourself with. And they respond, but sir, we can't make it that far, we're at our limit. Our lives matter. And you say, but my life and the lives of my wife and children, they matter too. But just then, you realize that in that critical moment, it is their lives that are in peril, not yours. In that critical moment, it is their lives that are in peril, not yours. If you simply say all lives matter, there's a danger of falsely implying that every group of Americans is facing the same degree of peril, which then makes it possible to ignore or deny pressing, obvious inequities in our country. Aggrieved individuals and groups feel that those who say all lives matter do not really mean it. They point to George Orwell's Animal Farm. In the novella, the line, all animals are equal, became all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Black Lives Matter. All the animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The point of Black Lives Matter is that many in the African American community face existential threats that must not be ignored. At the same time, I do not think that people are being consistent if they proclaim Black Lives Matter and keep silent about the alarming number of young African American males who die at the hands of other young African American males, or about the alarmingly high number of abortions that bring erupt end to nascent Black lives that surely matter. If all lives matter, then all lives matter. H, are white police officers racist? After the death of Mr. Floyd, some protesters demanded defunding of the police. The death of so many people like Mr. Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, people of colors, in altercations with white police officers compels some to think that most white police, or maybe all, are racist, or at best, they are certainly guilty of racial prejudice. From my experience, I'm not sure that I can agree that all police officers are racist. I don't think that is the case. Yet, we all know that the work of police officers is very difficult and very dangerous. Because of the violence in American society, they leave their homes each day not knowing if they will return home unharmed. They deserve our respect and gratitude. They are forced to make split-second life and death decisions on which their lives and the lives of others depend. In some communities, many police officers are faithful Christians and churchgoers who strive to live by the gospel each day. Most police officers are fair-minded and respect the human dignity and the worth of all citizens. Some, however, are not. Some, however, are not. And some means more than a few. Some, however, are not. And some means more than a few. There is credible evidence that bias and prejudice, even racism, influences the attitudes and actions of many police officers, no matter what their racial background might be. It is a fact, however, that some young African American men commit crimes requiring their arrest by the police. However, this should not lead to the demonization of all African American men as dangerous, violent criminals. Young, unarmed African American men suspected of minor criminal offenses should never be tried, convicted, and executed on the streets of our cities. It is a fact that some white police officers use excessive force and display racial prejudice, even racism, when they interact with African American people suspected of crimes. However, this should not lead to the demonization of all white police officers as racist, ready to kill African American people at the slightest provocation. Part 2, a partial glimpse of my personal journey. A, double consciousness. Double consciousness. During my seminary high school years, I became aware of a certain dualism. I regularly read Life magazine, Time magazine, Look magazine, Reader's Digest, the National Geographic, and the local newspaper with interest. But at the same time, I read the influential John H. Johnson publications Ebony and Jet, which were filled with positive stories about hardworking, successful African-American people. I also read the Negro Digest, the Chicago Defender, the city's read African American newspaper. But it gradually dawned on me that I was living in and knowledgeable of two distinct worlds, the white world as well as the black world. I could easily talk with my seminary classmates about events in the white world. However, most of them, if not all of them, were ignorant of everything going on in the black world. This made me reticent about bringing up topics from Ebony or the Defender. I was inescapably saturated with the world of the Eurocentric culture of my seminary classmates. However, there was no need for my seminary colleagues to know anything about or care anything about the world of Afrocentric culture. In later years, I discovered a vocabulary for these experiences in W.E. Du Bois' pioneering 1903 study, The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois described my experience as double consciousness. He argued that African American people almost always see the world around them through two rather distinct lenses. There is the lens shaped by the unique history of people as descendants of enslaved free human beings. That is, their self-consciousness, their self-understanding. But there's also the lens of the consciousness through which the larger white world views them. These two consciousnesses are, at times, almost contradictory. This is not unlike what James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and others have called the white gaze. They spoke of their struggle to write in their own voice without being constrained by regard for what white critics or white readers think about their work. They were freed finally to speak about their own experience in their own authentic voice and not to heed the white gaze looking over their shoulders. My reading of W.E. Du Bois' landmark study provided me with insights that were a great help to me throughout my early years of scholarship. I understood why, when I read texts of seminal philosophers, for example, when I read Aristotle, Plato, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Camus, Sartre, Heidegger, Otto Richter, Wittgenstein, Derrida, and others, and influential theologians, St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Thomas Aquinas, Bernard Herring, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, Pierre Thiers de Chardin, Karl Rahner, Bernard Lonergan, Hans Kuhn, Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, and others, when I read these works, they were all written from a Eurocentric perspective, which is generally thought, and my teachers thought, their perspective is the perspective. It is universal, it is objective, it applies to everyone. B, theology in a new key. As a result, when liberation theology, African American or black theology, and feminist theology emerged, many commentators dismissed this theology in a new key. These works were considered a transient fad, of interest perhaps because of their detailed, angst-laden theological insights and concerns about the life experiences of so-called minority groups, but had little or no universal, lasting values. Other critics dismissed this seminal work, saying these theological developments are a type of victimization that take on the paradigm of God calling Moses to deliver the children of Israel from oppression of Pharaoh in Egypt to freedom in the new land, and using that as a framework for analyzing the experience of African American oppression through the social conflict lens of Karl Marx. Still, other commentators judge all such political theology as subjective, approaching theology in a way that is incompatible with the biblical foundations and objective truth of Christian theology, which cannot be appropriated and used to advance social and political objectives, no matter how worthy they may be. C, African American theology. Meanwhile, African American or black theology emerged through the writings of influential African Americans, initially great Protestant thinkers. Among them were certainly Albert G. Cleage Jr., The Black Messiah, J.D. Otis Roberts, Liberation and Reconciliation, Black Theology and Dialogue, William R. Jones, Is God of White Races, and James Cone, Black Theology and Black Power, A Black Theology of Liberation, and God of the Oppressed. My conversations with Dr. Cone, reading his books and examining his methodology and experiencing his passionate commitment were for me truly an eye-opener. His works made me aware of a more existential approach to theology that was quite different from the traditional European and American academic theology that I had learned earlier. My training in classical Catholic theology and methodology made it clear to me that there was a necessary tension between Black theology and traditional theology in the Catholic Church. This tension is rooted in part in the fact that Catholic theological thought is necessarily linked to the magisterium, the formal normative teaching authority of the Catholic Church as expressed by the Holy Father, the Bishop of Rome, and the bishops of the world in communion with him as Pope, the primary teacher of Catholics on matters of faith and matters of morality. After publishing writings concerning African American Catholics and commentaries on Black theology, I was encouraged by Dr. Cohn to consider making the steps needed to become one of the Catholic voices of Black theology in the United States. Though I was very sympathetic to many of the themes and concerns of Afrocentric theology, I was not fully at ease with the confrontational style of some proponents, nor did I want to write and publish in open oppositions to the clear teachings of the Catholic Church on some difficult topics. I was very aware of other Catholic scholars, men and women, who could explore the concerns of Black theology through the lens of the Catholic tradition and the social teachings of the Second Vatican Council, perhaps more effectively and more fruitfully than I could. And so I turned away from the idea of making that a primary project of mine to address the question of Black theology as a primary concern of my writings, though my writings are certainly influenced by the literature that I absorbed over time. D, the Chautauqua Institution and reparations. The Chautauqua Institution near Buffalo, New York, is a summer haven in a bucolic setting for people interested in exploring religion, ideas, and the enjoyment of culture. It is a wonderful place. It is also a predominantly white world that in recent years has made at least early efforts towards diversity by inviting people like me and many others to speak, and by establishing what is now called the new African American Heritage House as a part of the Chautauqua Institution. There are houses for all kinds of religious traditions, but this is the African American Heritage House. In a recent summer, the informal discussion at the African American Heritage House turned to the question of reparation for African Americans in response to the reality of slavery. You know this is a difficult and volatile topic. We began with House of Representative Bill 40, which proposes the establishment of a commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans, to examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present, and to recommend appropriate remedies. According to the bill, this commission should identify the role of federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery, identifying forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and identifying lingering negative effects of slavery in the living African American community today. Some participants argued forcefully that this is a completely unrealistic proposal with no hope of succeeding, no place in government legislation. It simply won't happen. What would be appropriate remedies to slavery? Money? How much money? Paid to whom? Paid by whom? Only to poor African Americans? How poor must they be? Who would decide? Whose money would it be? Other participants asserted that these are the very questions that the proposed bill asks the government to study. Let us not answer them before we ask them. In seeking to get more background, we learn that most Americans do not support the idea of reparations, period. While 59% of African Americans support cash payments to those whose ancestors were enslaved, only 6% of white Americans hold that opinion. 63% of African Americans are in favor of educational and job training opportunities for those whose ancestors were enslaved, but only 19% of white people share this position. And as someone pointed out, it's likely to be their money that will be paying these reparations. Opponents of any form of reparations argue that no single group was enriched by slavery, and no single group should be called upon to bear the responsibility of slavery. The number of white people who owned slaves were small. Many more white people died in the Civil War than those who died in slavery. And those who supported slavery, many more white people died in the Civil War than those who supported slavery. Today, our multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic society should not be arbitrarily blamed for the misdeeds of the past. Let the past bury the past. At the Chautauqua Institution, Maryland's Episcopal Bishop Eugene T. Sutton, who testified before Congress in support of House Bill 40, argued that reparations should not be thought of simply as white people giving money to individual African American people because they feel guilty for the past. It requires us to acknowledge the racial divide among us. Reparations will help mend what is broken. All of us have a moral responsibility to be a part of mending what has been broken. A structure has been broken at the foundations, and it cannot stand unless it is repaired. He argued reparations quite simply means repairing that which has been broken, making it whole again. Bishop Sutton said reparations should be the work of healing the country. And then he startled us all by proposing $500 billion for reparations, which he contrasted with the $6 trillion that the US government has spent on wars since 2001 alone. He proposed $500 billion in contrast with $6 trillion. And the money should not be given to individuals, but to schools, job training, housing, environmental sustainability, and nursing homes that benefit needy people of color. Many people in our conversation argued that the federal government would never, ever consider supporting such a proposal as this. E, the Catholic Church and reparations. The Catholic bishops of the United States have never made a statement about the controversial topic of reparations. Still, there are some indications that religious institutions may be amongst the first to take modest steps towards some form of reparation. In September 2019, more than 100 years after the last enslaved free human beings ceased their work on the building, Virginia Theological Seminary took a step toward reparations for the practice of slave labor. The seminary became one of the first American institutions to set aside money for the direct purpose of benefiting current family members of those who built the seminary. A $1.7 million reparation fund has been established. Part of that money will be used to cover the tuition of African American seminarians. Earlier, the Sisters of the Society of the Sacred Heart established a reparations fund to create scholarships for African American students in Grand Couteau, Louisiana, where 150 enslaved free people were once owned by the religious sisters. Get your mind around that. Once owned by Catholic religious sisters, owned human beings. This comes after the vote by students of Georgetown University to establish a fund with student fees to assist the descendants of the 272 enslaved free human beings once owned by the Jesuits and sold in 1838 to maintain the new school. The university also made a formal apology to the descendants and offered preferential admission to them. At the same time, some of these descendants have asked for a $1 billion foundation to fund some of their educational, health and housing needs. Such a fund has not yet been established. These unexpected and admittedly modest steps may indicate that the issue of reparation has the potential of one day being addressed to some degree by voices within the church. It has the potential of being addressed to some degree. When and to what degree, who can say? Now we must conclude. When you are speaking from a moving viewpoint and aware of the time, you cannot pause even to catch your breath. And even so, we have skipped several pages. So, dear sisters and brothers in Christ, my writings and my lectures on the racial divide are intended to invite individuals and groups of different racial backgrounds to enter with open minds and open hearts into conversations about this important and sensitive subject of the racial divide without hostility, without judgment of others. My goal is to help all of us to attain a greater understanding and greater mutual respect. My hope is to move some people to make realistic efforts to bridge the racial divide. This can only come about by a deep interior conversion of hearts and minds, made possible by an openness to the power of the Holy Spirit. As I say, this can only come about by a spiritual transformation, a prayerful openness to the call of the Holy Spirit to do what is right and just, even if it is difficult. But I must admit, in truth, this is a high and distant goal. This is a high and distant goal. The remarkable St. Teresa of Calcutta, who I was fortunate to meet on several occasions, we even spoke together at a Sarah convention in Sydney, Australia, many years ago. She faced a high and distant goal when she and her sisters tried to address the enormous suffering and poverty in Calcutta in India. She was often told by others that she and her sisters were wasting their time. You will have no impact on the social, economic, and political structures in India. They are the root cause of the suffering that has moved you so deeply, sister. There is really nothing you can do. And this petite, wonderful woman of grace replied, well, I and my sisters cannot possibly have a major impact on such widespread, unspeakable pain, suffering, and social evil. We cannot overcome the caste system that has been in India for generations. We cannot undo political corruption. We cannot provide food, housing, education, employment, and health care to the vast, vast numbers of people who are dying on our streets in Calcutta and the streets of the cities of India every day. But then she told me, she said, but while we may not be able to do a great deal to change the world around us, God calls us to do something, no matter how seemingly insignificant. God calls everyone to realize that we are compelled to do what we can. God calls everyone to realize that we are compelled to do what we can. The Catholic Church and the racial divide in the United States, you and I are compelled to do what we can. To bridge the racial divide, we must listen to all voices. To bridge the racial divide, we must learn everything we can. To bridge the racial divide, we must think long and hard. To bridge the racial divide, we must pray always for conversion in our own souls. And to bridge the racial divide, we must act. To bridge the racial divide, you and I must listen, we must learn, we must think, we must pray, we must act. We must do what we can. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've been watching my time, and fortunately, speaking fast helps. So some of you probably have to leave, but if you have questions or comments, please come to the microphone so everyone can hear you. And don't hesitate to disagree with what I say. I'm only telling you what I think. You should tell me what you think. Please come to the microphone if you have questions or comments. Please, yes. Yes, please. And there's a microphone over here as well. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Gelasius Morgan.
I think you can pull the microphone up so you don't have to bend over so much.
You're right.
There you go.
Okay. My name is Gelasius Morgan. I'm a senior at John Adams High School, and I'm also a founding member of Black Lives Matter South Bend and a representative of the Global Network.
Wonderful.
And I just have a question because I feel like our country just lacks so much. So what do you suggest that not just you Christians and you Christians in the Catholic community throughout the country to do to strengthen our communities and countries' social consciousness so we can continue to destroy the system of racism and just become a better humanity?
What can be done to destroy the system of racism? That's a big.
What can we do?
Yeah.
Like keep on and
Yeah.
for America to gain
Yeah.
social consciousness.
First of all, I don't know that the system of racial prejudice or racism can be destroyed because it probably almost built into the human condition because of the tragedy of sin. But that does not mean I don't agree with Sister Mother Teresa. We must do what we can. Certainly, one of the things we must do is to make more clear our educational ministries. I'm giving a talk in Salt Lake City in a week or so to the National Catholic Education Association. Our Catholic schools are a major force in the United States. Notre Dame is one example, but our elementary schools and high schools are. And so we must make sure that without getting into the controversy of what is called critical race theory, that actual history is taught correctly and that we help our students to learn that we all have a role to play in making things that were done poorly in the past to be done better in the present and in the future. I think that the opportunities to be in conversation with groups like Black Lives Matter, even those who might find themselves somewhat uncomfortable or think they might disagree with some positions of Black Lives Matter, I'm often in conversation with groups and structures where I find myself disagreeing, but I learn from listening. That's why I ended with the imperatives. Listen, learn, think, pray, and act. Those are not just words. In order to bridge such differences as we find in our country today, we must listen to people who radically disagree with us, learn from them, understand by standing under their experience, listen, and then pray about it. Listen, learn, think about it, and then determine what actions we ourselves can take. But there is no, I will acknowledge right off, there is no simple formula to accomplish what you're talking about. It is what people in my position and people in a place like this university must work at constantly, and people like yourself coming forward through high school and college must bring to bear from your own experience what you can do, and not to be discouraged by the fact that radical change of difficult problems never comes about quickly. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, 4 steps forward, 3 steps backward. It's a slow and painful process, but you simply can't give up because what you're doing is right. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. I am Tochukwu Aya. I'm a PhD student in biblical studies at Notre Dame here. So I wanted to push back a bit on your first part one. Well, not really push back, maybe bring attention to bear on your part one, where you said that most Americans are not racists. I have a bit of problem with that.
Many people do.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. So my problem with that is MLK would say that his problem in his letter from Birmingham jail.
Yes, I know it well.
So he said that the problem that they, the civil rights leaders, are facing are not actually so much those who antagonize them, the whites who antagonize them, as the moderates who were silent in the face of the evil of racism.
Yeah, I hear you.
And he made it very clear that these are actually the problems that they have. These ones that are silent and that look on when injustice reigns and when the black lives are, treated, are maltreated, and so on. And so he said that these are the problems they have. Not so much these other ones than these ones.
I know the letter well.
And a number of scholars, recent scholars, have equally pointed out that white moderates, white and every other person that is moderate, as regards or silent, or maybe still slumbering as regards the question of racism in America and probably in the world, are more problematic to deal with.
No, I
people that say that, like somebody who will tell you that I'm less racist than you, or I'm less racist than every other person in the room, that they are actually more
That's a
problematic.
famous quotation.
Yeah. So that's my first question. So how would you
Only
address that?
Only one question at a time, because there are other people. Only
Okay.
one question at a time, because other people have questions. So let me start with that question, okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I'm very aware of the fact that many people would like to take the position that all white people are racist. It simply makes no sense to me. I know too many people. I travel around the country and around the world. If we start with that point of view, like the speaker at this dialogue on racial harmony, you're all a bunch of white racists. You exclude the possibility of conversation. You're making a judgment about the inner lives of people you don't know, and I just refuse to do that. I acknowledge the fact that many people, because of the culture, absorb a certain racial bias or prejudice, but I distinguish that from racism. So I'm not denying prejudice and bias that many people may have, but racism, as I use it, is an overt moral evil, a desire to harm people. So it's an intentional reality. If someone who just sitting at a table says at a Chinese restaurant, "I really love this Chinese food, but I really don't think I don't really like Chinese people." Now that's a moral fault. That's a judgment. That's a harmful thing. But they never ever do anything to harm Chinese people in any way. But they've acknowledged this kind of latent bias. To me, that's a part of the racial divide. A person who's a racist against Chinese people is out to harm them. You can't live here, you can't study here, you can't work here. If I had a chance, I would kill you. To me, that's racism. Because we have to acknowledge the fact that racism, or at least extreme prejudice, is an equal opportunity employer. All people of all backgrounds can harbor certain types of bias against certain types of people. It's an equal opportunity reality. So I'm not denying the contents of Dr. King's great letter. I agree with the contents at all completely. But the fact that someone is moderate, he's talking about indifference. Everybody, and he would certainly acknowledge this, is not able to stand up and then be an aggressive agent for social change. If you are a married woman with a house to maintain and you're working, you have 4 or 5 children, to do that is more than you can do. If you are a man who is out of a job and trying to get part-time work for your family, and you're living in a situation where there are not many resources, you may not find that you have the soul space to be actively involved and work for racial justice. So I'm taking a very existential approach, saying, if you take the position that all white people are racist, to me you have to say all people are racist, because we are all prejudiced against some people to different degrees in different ways, whether we know it or not. But bias and prejudice or a kind of a low-grade negative sentiment is a part of the human condition born of ignorance, born of ignorance. Racism is, as I use it, I'm deliberately redefining the words for my purposes, is overt, active hostility. You raise a good point, though. I think you're next.
I just want to, Dr. Valerie Lewis Mosley, I'm a member of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. I want to take address at the definition of racism, and even in using this synonymous relationship of racial divide and racism, because there is a distinct difference. And racism at its core doesn't even have to be that I intend harm, just the belief factor that someone else is lesser or inferior.
Absolutely.
Or that the privilege by which I live because of me benefiting from the economic commodification of Black and brown bodies means that there's a participation in the racism, even if there is not an overt or violent action.
Absolutely.
And so I think we have to be careful in using the language of bias and prejudice as being something that we all participate in and that we could all be racist. Because racism is about power. And no matter how much I may or may not like a particular person from a particular class or ethnicity, as a Black Catholic woman, I don't have power to limit the access or the presence of any other class
I
of
agree
people.
with that.
And so I think that we have to break these words down because words do matter.
Oh, yes.
I think that we also have to engage the fact that in 1968, Black bishops, Black priests, Black deacons, and Black women religious did specify that the Catholic Church as an institution was a racist institution.
brothers and sisters
and we
to us,
have to clarify that. And even if we don't believe that all individual police officers are racist,
I don't
the
believe it.
police department in this country was formed on racism. And so we have to talk about the systematic situation.
I think you've given me enough.
That
I think
we
you've given,
need to
I think
break
you've
this
given, you've given me
down
enough
and
because I
unpack
can't
it.
comment if you don't. If you, I don't disagree with. We talked earlier about my comments on minority groups. I don't disagree. I think my distinctions are maybe just simply more nuanced. I'm very aware of the fact that some people are the beneficiaries of systemic and systematic prejudice or racism. They are also the beneficiaries of white supremacy and white privilege. But I don't think it's correct to ignore individual intentionality. Individual people living their lives as Christian men and women as best they can, even though they have a job in part because of a system that went before them. They had nothing to do with the system, but they've benefited from that. I would not brand them a racist in an overt sense. So I'm deliberately and intentionally and committed to defining my language for my purposes in my context of my published statements without denying the broader way in which it is used. It is certainly true that the police departments, fire departments, maybe more so, are born out of exclusionary and racist structure, but I would not argue that every police officer or every fireman or woman is himself or herself a racist. And so...
And just for point of clarity, I am the daughter of someone who served 30 years of their 51 years as a police officer. And so what I'm saying is both Black and white police officers can participate
Oh, yes, of course.
in the institution of racism.
Oh, I know.
So we need to really unpack these two dialects.
Nothing you said do I disagree with. It's only that I like to use my terminology in my way in the context of what I have to say. It doesn't work if it's transferred into another framework. That's why I so carefully, just like my use of the term enslaved free human beings, most people, when I say that, well, what do you mean they weren't slaves? They were slaves. Well, the way I'm using it, I can't use that terminology. I understand how you're using it, but listen to what I've said when I lay out why I don't say slaves. Yes, please.
Hi. One of the things that has bothered me when I look at the pro-life movement, one of the things that bothers me when I look at the pro-life movement.
Is it on? Is it on? It needs. You need to go. You need to put it on the other side of the mask.
One of the things that bothers me when I look at the pro-life movement is the organizations. I never hear them sending out, saying and asking their members to write letters to the governor when it comes to the death penalty and someone is going to be executed. And it seems to me that if they're going to be pro-life, then it's got to be not
Pro-life.
just for
I know.
the baby in the womb, but it has to also be for that person sitting on death row.
I hear you. I hear you.
Why do you think there is, yes, the bishops will write a letter,
Yes, no, I
but
hear-
why
no.
do you think the organizations who are pro-life don't write letters?
That's a very good question, which I've thought about and spoken about many times. There's no simple answer to that. Some people in the pro-life movement take a holistic approach. They're concerned about the elderly, they're concerned about the homebound, they're concerned about the people who are dealing with dementia, and also people who are condemned and on death row. Some people are, but there's a broad percentage who are less publicly concerned about that. They say in some of their publications the reason is this is their fundamental, or you can only fight so many battles, as some of my pro-life friends say in some meetings that I go to. Since they can only fight so many battles, they choose this battle. It's not that they don't know that there are other battles to be fought, but they think that because the country has moved in a direction where so many abortions take place, and this is innocent human life gestating in the womb, that they choose that. But some people argue that that's an easy way to go about it, because to be concerned about the innocent in the womb, you're not concerned about the injustice of so many people of color who are on death row, who may be innocent of the crimes they've been convicted of. And they argue that that all may be, but they would argue somewhat like Mother Teresa did, I'm doing what I can do. Somebody else can do that. I'm doing what I can do. Other people would criticize them. Well, then you're being too selective, too selective. But we all know that when it comes to how much soul space you have to engage complex, difficult issues, each individual only has so much soul space. And one cannot be an activist in the best sense for all of the critical, challenging, and morally difficult issues that we face in this country. It's impossible. You never sleep. But you're right, generally speaking, some of the most vocal people who are pro-life or against abortion do not speak on these other areas. I'm very aware of that. Who was that on this side? Yes, please.
First off, thank you so much, Reverend, for being here and speaking with us today. My name is Madeline. I'm a sophomore here studying Africana Studies and Psychology. And in my class the other day, we talked a lot about Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparation and the 5 different categories of reparations. And I was wondering, after your talk today about it, which of the 5 reparations you think is most sustainable and effective for us to carry
I have
through.
gone through that book. I don't know the answer to that question. I think we're just at the water's edge of this conversation, and his book is a great contribution to it, but I wouldn't want to pick one. If you haven't read the book, I recommend it, because he's contributing to the dialogue, but I think it's too soon to single out. I think we need to have the conversation about but the whole framework of his book and the other writings that are coming forward on that topic. I'm glad to hear that you're reading it, though. I'm glad to hear that. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your talk. Diane Pender-Hughes, political scientist and former chair of Africana Studies here. I was interested in hearing your perspective on, or the report on the, I'm bringing up the question of reparations, but a little bit differently, a little bit more practically, in the sense of, is this something, since you were a member of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, where the bishops have begun to talk about those issues?
Not that I know of. Not public, not in any committee that I've been on, or not in any public or executive session. Certainly bishops in their own dioceses probably have talked with individuals about it, or with an ecumenical dialogue, but there's been no public discourse about it, because there are so many, I mean, they've in the most, when Brothers and Sisters to Us was written on racism prevailing in the church, the question of reparation was not much in the air. And when the most recent Open Wide Our Hearts follow-up pastoral letter came out 2 years ago, it was not addressed. It did not seem helpful to include it with all the other things they were trying to include, nor was there, bishops' public statements can only be published with a consensus among nearly 300 bishops. If the bishops don't vote in enough numbers to approve it, it can't be published as a bishop statement. An individual bishop may, and I wouldn't be surprised if some individual bishop might not at some point write on this topic, but it is a topic that, from the point of view of a large ecclesial community like the Catholic Church, is not sufficiently mature for the bishops to make a helpful comment on. They need to keep learning about it and thinking about it and hearing about it, but somebody, well, the bishop should just be prophetic and say, obviously, the church should be the first to divest itself of as much money as it can because of its own sins of racial prejudice. You see individual groups, like the nuns I spoke about, like Georgetown, who have done individual things, but that's very different from the bishops' conference collectively saying or doing something. That would be a more difficult move.
So I was thinking of the Georgetown case in the sense of whether or not there's any communication between the bishops and
Sure.
the leadership at Georgetown in terms of their decision.
Yes, I am, Dr. DeGioia, the president of Georgetown, and I are very good friends. Certainly people have spoken with him, and some of the faculty members there are students of mine from my days teaching at Harvard, but that's different, though, than the bishops themselves making a collective public statement. Anybody else have a question or comment?
I've gotten the sign that we have to get out. We have to adjourn by 6 o'clock, so that needs to be the last question. And so all of us, please join me in thanking Bishop Braxton.
All right. You are most welcome. Let me leave you with these words, very simple words from John Donne. Wilt thou love God as God loves thee? Then digest, dear soul, this wholesome meditation. 'Twas much that man was made like God before, but that God is made like man much more. Peace be with you.